Good evening, everyone. We're going here to make a short discussion of the rational foundations of human rights. First, let's clarify what is the subject matter of our inquiry. The question we're asking is why we should believe in human rights, why we should act on human rights, why we should legalize human rights. The magic word here is should. We're asking an ethical question that demands an ethical answer. It is not proper to say, well, we have signed all these human rights treaties and then it's obvious that we have to comply with them. That could be okay at one level, but it's not okay now. Because the question remains, why should we obey these human rights treaties? Why should we honor the rules that we have legalized instead of other rules? Because naturally, we could have had a different list of human rights, or we could have a different ideal. And so instead of human rights, we could have had ethical socialism or radical democracy. So why human rights? Some people are impatient with these sorts of questions. They think that in a world that is rife with human rights violations, it's a waste of time to inquire on the justice of human rights. That the better question is how. How can we enforce human rights? What strategies can we use to enforce human rights? I do not deny that the question of strategies is important, but if we do not address the should question beforehand, I believe we're doing something wrong. If we name and shame people, if we make a media campaign against people, or if we authorize military force against someone in our aim to enforce human rights, we're using power, we're using force against a person. So we better be sure when we do this that we're doing something reasonable, because otherwise our behavior will be no different from bullying, indoctrination, or violence. The dignity of the person against whom we are enforcing human rights demands that we have some reasons backing up our actions. Rational reasons. Maybe that's a bit weird thing to say, but rational reasons means reasons that can be shared, that can be recognized by whoever is at the receiving end of our enforcement efforts. So I will present three theories for the rational foundations of human rights. You could present more, you could present less, but I believe that these three theories are the best contenders, the main contenders to give us a satisfying answer. I will begin with the theory of epistemic natural law. There's many versions of natural law. Some of them I consider to be very unsuccessful. I will explain the most successful version of the doctrine, at least in my view, the most successful version of the doctrine, which is epistemic natural law. The basic idea of epistemic natural law is that we know some basic moral propositions naturally, and that means to say non inferentially. We have direct, certain knowledge about the goodness or specifically the badness of some things. We do not need additional information than our human embodiment to know, for example, that losing an arm is a setback, that my family members are persons. I do not need to be told this. I do not need an explanation. I know it right now. And then, just like that, I also know that a soldier stomping the face of a child in the curb, is a violation. I know that torture, for example, introducing syringes in the fingernails of detained persons, is a violation. I know that they are wrong. I know that slavery is wrong. To put it in the way that it was put in Quora, this website of people asking questions, somebody asked a question, can somebody explain to me why slavery is wrong? And then one of the answers, the most voted answer was, well, if you need to be told why slavery is wrong, you need to seek help. Find help, please. And I think that sort of answer captures the spirit of what we're talking about. The idea that there will be some sort of knowledge that is inherent, immediate, non inferential. You do not need an explanation because you immediately grasp it. Things that we know right now without extra information that are axiomatic, they would constitute the basis of epistemic natural law. The idea being that some rights, or rather say that some things are wrong, we know immediately, and rights are the legal envelope that we make around these self evident violations. Notice that the idea here is that this is a type of knowledge. It's not an emotional reaction, it's a form of rational knowledge. So if I see a soldier stomp in the face of a child, my my grasp right there, my understanding right there that this is wrong does not mean simply that I dislike it. Of course, I also dislike it, but that's not it. That's not the bottom of it. It's more than just an emotional reaction. There's knowledge about what is going on. This idea of self evidence is very unpopular in academia. Of course, academics are, by their job, by their profession, they're given the job to doubt everything. So it makes it rather difficult to talk about this sort of theory in academia right now because that's not how we see our profession. But authors working in this line of work, they insist that there's some things that you cannot really doubt, some things that you cannot reasonably doubt. So the moment you start doubting that, for example, you have two hands, well, you could pretend to doubt it, but really you don't. It's something that is you can feign, you can make a sort of a pretense or a game out of doubting it, but it's already clear that you know it. And authors in this line of work would say that this type of reasoning is the one that can really capture the basic nature of fundamental rights. Imagine I explain to you why torture is wrong with a big philosophical theory that starts with some system of utility and then some calculations that down the line a certain type of behavior will reduce utility and torture being one of them. So imagine I do something like that. I say, well, isn't that theory just decorative? Now, if the theory said something else, we would reject the theory. So our certainty in these issues is so high that if a theory gets it wrong, if you have a theory, let's say some form of utilitarianism justifying slavery or torture, then you say, by that reason, I reject utilitarianism because it gets wrong this very basic axiom of thinking in terms of, if thinking in basic moral terms. This theory also has the benefit of being very close to the way that the actual law was written. Because if you see the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, you're not going to see a fantastic theory of lots of deductions and inferences giving you the list of human rights. It's just quite simple. If you recognize the human dignity of every human being, of every person, these rights follow. So I think that way this theory is also pretty successful. Of course, this theory faces a very big problem, and that problem is not a skepticism. Let's say that that's pretty academic. The problem that this theory faces is disagreement. Well, I would take it that nobody would disagree with the idea that torture and slavery are violations. Some may want to justify torture in special cases, but still they regard it as a violation. So notice that that's very deeply woven. But once you move from certain safe examples, so you go for something like euthanasia, some people will see it as the paradigmatic of human rights violations, whereas others will see it as an exercise of human rights. So it's not just wrong. It's not wrong. It's actually right. It's just the opposite. And the fact that human rights has a lot of polemics like this uh, makes this theory appear rather weak sometimes. The reason I present this theory, in fact, in spite of this problem, is because I believe the theory is pretty resilient to disagreement. Like the people that got this theory moving, like the people that invented this theory or presented this theory for the first time, were not so naive that they did not understand that disagreement would be a problem. They say, well, two things you have to notice. We can actually be wrong about what's self evident. Something can be self evident, but still we might not get to grasp it for whatever reason. And then that this is true if you have some experience in something like mathematics or logic. You find that the actions of mathematics, if you were able to grasp them, they're self evident. But try grasping them. If you do, you're far smarter than I am. But point being, that you can still be wrong about what's self-evident. Something being axiomatic essentially means that it's properly basic. You don't derive it from anything else, but it might still be inaccessible to you because you might not be in the right position to grasp it. That's one issue. And the second one, which is, I would say, even, and when I explained the theory, I was a little bit uncautious with how I explained it. And the distinction here is one that you will better find in the writing. And the other thing that we find here in this theory is that, well, it can also be the case that principles are self-evident, but that their application in concrete cases, it's actually the problem. And this theory will not dispute that. So, for example, imagine the debate on euthanasia or even the debate on abortion. Well, people actually don't disagree that life is fundamental and sacred. People do not disagree that privacy is fundamental and that autonomy is fundamental. What they disagree about is what trumps in a specific circumstance where there is something to be said for a principle on both sides of the debate. And then naturally, that will be difficult, and nothing in this theory aims to deny that. So that is as far as I go for this one. Now let's move on to the next one. The next theory is contractualism, social contract theories. I think these are the most orthodox theories of rights, the most widely accepted, even the most likely to be successful. They're not perfect. I will make a comment of a typical problem, of a typical stumbling block of these theories a little bit later down the road. But let's just try to give a brief schemata of what contractual theories of rights would be. And here I want to, in a way, ignore the details of uh, Hobbes or Rawls or Kant, if you interpret Kant as a contractual or proto-contractual writer. I want to ignore the details and just, or Locke, of course, let's not forget Locke, and but then just try to stay on what's the very basic idea there. The very basic idea is, think of a fair society. Think of a legitimate human society as one that is consensual. Now, we have something, when we talk about things being right, we have something that we seem that's very powerful to rely on, which is the legitimacy of consent. If I consent to something, then it must be at some level right. So, and then how when we think of a fair society? Well, we think of a fair society as a society we could consent to, a society we could agree to live in, not just accept, agree, consent, as if you had a choice. And then it's pretty simple to get from that standpoint to rights, because it's sort of transparent to say that we would not consent to live in a society where we cannot speak, to live in a society where we cannot worship, or not be forced to worship if that's your inclination, right? Or to live in a society where you can be arbitrarily killed, where the Black Marias can come at night and pick you up and send you to the gulag for no reason whatsoever. So we would not consent to live in this sort of society, and then that society is legitimate. Now, so in order for us to sign in to the social club, we need to be given something. We need to be given some sort of basic protections of our basic freedoms, our basic interests, and there you go. That's a list of human rights. That's all you need. And thinking of society as a contract, then, leads us naturally to get into a list of rights. And this theory looks actually very pleasing to the modern mind. And that's very opposed to the epistemic natural law theory, because the epistemic natural law theory immediately, if you come from a social sciences background or from a humanities background, is going to crash into a wall. The first wall is going to be skepticism. The second wall is going to be disagreement. And it would seem that the social contract theory does not enter into those problems because, as a theory, it's a formal theory. It does not make explicit value judgments and say, oh, this is horrible, this is a crime, this is the worst thing that could ever happen, this is the dignity and this is not dignity. It doesn't really get into those value judgments. Uh, Essentially, what it does is says, okay, let's imagine people however they are. Maybe this person likes certain things or hates other things. Maybe this person believes in some things, does not believe in others. People, however they are, we do not judge their opinions, but rather we say, okay, what do they need in order to live together? What agreement? And that agreement does not even, you don't have to say that agreement is true. You don't have to say that agreement is the real truth. You just have to say that's something that works to get us living together. And so you avoid getting into the problem of the skepticism, and at least at first glance, you avoid getting into the problem of radical disagreement because it's supposed to work in spite or on top of radical disagreement. So imagine you have this sort of typical scenario where A believes in God X, B is an atheist, C believes in God Y. From their own religious and irreligious vantage points, they have things they find particularly dignified and things they find particularly horrible. The contractual model would, at least in theory, so far it works, skip trying to give a judgment on whether God X is the real God, or the atheist is actually right and there is no God, or actually the real God is God Y, or any other combination. It would say, let's put that under brackets. We don't need to get into that. We accept your differences. Let's just find a system of life where, or rather, a system of rights that would allow you to enter society and live together. And then maybe a typical freedom of religion may be just what the doctor orders. Freedom of religion would mean that within your own private sphere, you can worship God X, you can worship no God, that is, do not worship, and this other person can worship God Y. And then without having had to say which one of you is right or which one of you expresses the true vision of human dignity, think of the epistemic natural law. I just put that under brackets and I give you certain freedoms and certain protections that make society a good deal for every one of you. And that is the great beauty and the great promise of contractual theories is the ability to do just that and put certain intractable problems under brackets. But then, does it really work? The contractual model has difficulties applying in the real world because real people are much more different than this hypothetical ABC persons believing in God X, atheism, and God Y. Real people are much more different than that. And real people are very difficult to fit in a contractual model because it can seem at times that there is simply no social order where both can really live together. I will give an example that will illustrate the problem. Imagine an extremely orthodox and extremely pious Muslim, a person who believes in Sharia law in the most, let's not say in a negative fashion, but in the most hardline manner, with no flexibilities for modernity, no modern interpretations, or anything like that. And then consider, on the other hand, a very radical feminist, a very radical feminist that believes that if you take feminism to its logical conclusion, and let's make it even more, let's make this person even more radical. The person is not just a radical feminist, he's also a radical Marxist, and his that with implication of radical historical materialism. And then neither of these two persons, and these are a bit of caricature that made them really very extreme opposed to each other, but you don't have to go that far to have problems like this. Neither of these two persons will consent to living with the rules that the other embraces. So if the pious Muslim wants to separate and rigid gender roles for men, male and female, and also will definitively believe that blasphemy should not just be considered wrong but illegal, and he will not want to live in any society where that is allowed. Of course, the radical feminist Marxist will consider that any difference of roles between men and women is a bias and discriminatory, and will not just want to permit blasphemy, but maybe, well, not all Marxists are like that, but there have been in the Soviet Union, maybe would actually want to encourage blasphemy as a way to rid people of that the opium of religion. So if both are 100% committed to their belief, if their beliefs are integral to their worldview, they will not want to consent to a system of life that the rules that one accepts and the rules that the other accept. And then if of course the typical liberal answer is to just say, well, privacy, practice privacy in the religion of your own home, or practice feminism and Marxism in the or and blasphemy in the privacy of your own home, and live in some sort of neutral public sphere. But then exactly the problem there is that the beliefs of these two people, A and B, are of such nature that if they're taken seriously, they do not allow to be restricted to their private sphere. Now, radical feminist will say emphatically it's the private sphere where we must intervene. That's we just cannot allow women in their private sphere to be subjected to biased stereotypes. And by the same token, the pious Muslim would say, well, my religion does not command me only to worship myself privately. My religion commands me to worship publicly and to fight for a society in which the true God is publicly worshipped. So then it becomes very difficult to say that these people, as such, without any modification, will consent to a liberal order of rights, to an order of rights. And then when this happens, and it will always happen that a contract will not allow for both parties, at least there won't find immediate terms of agreement unless one of them changes their position. That's where social contract theory gets into trouble, because they say, well, a social contract is one, not say one where actual people would consent to, because actual people might find nothing to consent to. Let's say this radical Muslim and this radical feminist. The social contract theory then gets modified, and then you say, well, it's what reasonable people would consent to. So instead of being a radical Muslim, he must be a reasonable Muslim, and instead of being a radical feminist, the person must be a reasonable feminist. All right, that sounds very positive, but what exactly does that mean? When exactly do you become a reasonable feminist, and when exactly do you become a reasonable Muslim? So the moment you start to ask questions like this, you start to enter into all the value judgments that at first glance you got rid of. And they say, well, the big advantage of this social contract method is that you get rid of the problems of disagreement and the problems of value judgments. Well, it turns out that if things play out in the way that I've described, then actually you don't. And if you say, well, no, a reasonable Muslim is one that limits his faith in this manner, whereas feminists are allowed to live their life more or less normally, then they will say the social contract is biased. that it's not truly fair, it's not truly neutral, it's actually loaded for the benefit of one party. Or if you flip it, and it's the reasonable Muslim that's allowed to live to have, for example, blasphemy laws, but the radical feminist is the reasonable feminist is not allowed to have the equivalent of them. Then again, you can say the contract is loaded, the contract is biased. So how do you find a middle ground here without entering into subjective value judgments that you want to get rid of? I think that is a very difficult task. Of course, there are efforts in that direction, but nothing that you could say, well, really, it's a magic bullet. And the final theory we will explore is consequentialism. So this theory is based on the utilitarianism of Bentham, which you probably are familiar with, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, as reformed by Mill, and then reformed by other authors who have followed essentially the Millian line, like in a way James Griffin or Amartya Sen, or maybe John Dewey. And essentially, the goal here is indeed to create the greatest good or the greatest happiness for the greatest number. So that does not get reformed. So you do keep that part of the formula, hence it's consequentialism. You try to achieve the best consequence possible, the greatest good, the greatest happiness, the greatest human flourishing. And if things were, if you just stop the description right there, you should get worried, because if you take the formula in its natural interpretation, the greatest good for the greatest number, and you know a little bit of how things work out politically, you will say, well, a formula like that is actually not, it's not the basis of human rights, but it's the perennial temptation to violate human rights. Now, get some people to work in the gulag so that we industrialize faster. Now, eliminate the political enemies, because after we get rid of them, we will have finally a harmonic and peaceful society. So essentially, the doctrine of mass murder typically has always been something along the lines of it's for the greater good. But it seems that after Mill and after Sen, after the modifications of these of authors that follow this sort of more humanistic consequentialism, something has changed, and consequentialism turns out to be hospitable to human rights, to be even potentially a strong backbone for a doctrine of human rights. And the modification is essentially twofold. First, no, we say, well, happiness. What is happiness? Happiness, or human happiness, is or requires freedom. Freedom is a part of happiness, and you could call it freedom. You could call it capabilities. Not too much hinges upon that. So first change is that freedom is a part of happiness. Second change is that freedoms are instrumental to happiness. Uh, to be happy, you have to be free first. And a free society is one where it's more likely that people are happy, that generally you have a good degree of happiness in the society. Well, let me give a little bit more credibility to these two theses, because these two theses on which you on which you turn Benthamic utilitarianism from something that's hostile to human rights into something that's potentially fertile ground for human rights are actually very defensible. These two theses. So first, freedom is a part of happiness. Uh, to In order to be truly happy, you need to be free. Well, what it is it to be fully happy? From If you explore that idea, and if you go beyond this very hedonic mindset of Bentham, though, that happiness is like a cold beer. If you want with deeper notions of happiness, we'll say, well, they have an inbuilt relationship to freedom. Now, think of the etymology of Aristotle's word for happiness, which is eudaimonia. You achieve your true self. Now, in order to achieve your true self, to unfold your real personality, your capabilities, your talents, you cannot do that in some sort of walled pleasure island controlled by robots. in sort of a Brave New World environment. To achieve your true self, to express your true self, you need to have action. You need to act as yourself in an environment where you are allowed to express your own ideas, your own autonomies, and so forth. And or if you go a little bit something into much more modern, and something that I find really very interesting, specifically from this perspective. If you see modern psychology has come up with the theory of flow, that there is a specifically important state, a positive state of the human mind, that is a state of action, of being immersed in some activity, of deploying one's agency, of one's autonomy, one's freedom skillfully. So that's psychology of flow. Let's say, well, wouldn't be me because I'm terrible at sports, but let's say you're playing this extremely good basketball game, and that you're so concentrated, you're so into it that you're in let's quite literal in the flow, or that you are playing guitar, and then you improve and you improve and you hit a point in which the song just comes naturally to you, and that is the moment in which you are truly happy. But then if you think about this, it does seem to make sense that to be truly happy, to be really happy, it's not just having some sort of warm meal and cold beer, but that you need agency, you need activity, you need free activity to be happy. So that is one part of it. So or to put it, let's say in some a bit more rough terms, happiness for human is not the happiness for a goldfish. No, we have something different that we need in order to be truly happy. And then for the latter, that freedom is instrumental to happiness, the idea here is that free societies are more likely to achieve good outcomes. And there's a lot of evidence here. The evidence is very difficult to assess because macro social scientific evidence can be very it can be can be very misleading. But the evidence here, what really got people thinking in this line was Amartya Sen work on famines. He said, well, no, free societies, and I believe the comparison at that point was India and China, and that is a problem, and I will explain why. The free societies, so societies that have freedom of speech, democracy, the ability to contest state government, to say, hey, you governor of this province, you're an idiot, my family is starving. Free societies that are much more likely to avoid catastrophes like famines because they have the ability, well, at the very least, they're more information rich. You are able to know what's going on because you're able to protest and people have to hear you. Whereas a society in which people have been silenced, a society that operates only in top down control, is a society that just has less information. And then, if you think it just from the perspective of information, more information, better decisions. So, free societies are more likely to achieve good outcomes and to avoid catastrophes, such as famines. Uh, I must say that personally, I am very attracted to this theory. I always, in my mind, when I think of these three theories, I somehow always have the temptation to say, well, consequentialist theory. That is really the one that makes sense, and or the one that would be robust, and the one that would give human rights a good compass for the 21st century. So I like this theory very much. But then let's say a little bit about its disadvantages. Or the first one would be a bit of an advantage too. So the first one is an advantage and a disadvantage is that the theory is empirical. And that is very advantageous because I believe empirical inquiry is probably the most developed, the most refined form of inquiry that human beings have. And if you tie human rights to empirical inquiry, then you have something that will protect us from dogmatism, from turning human rights into this sort of secular religion and blind ideology. And I because that I believe the threat of that is very large. By the same token, I find the empirical dimension here extremely attractive. The disadvantage, of course, and this might not, the way you see it, this might not deserve to be called a disadvantage, is that it might turn out that human rights are actually a false doctrine. And if we turn human rights into an empirical thesis, then that's something that just may happen. For example, it may turn out that people are actually happier when they are in an authoritarian regime. It might turn out that, for example, people in Fidel Castro's Cuba are actually happier than people in New York, which is something that I consider quite plausible. But then, of course, Castro, and that I use Fidel, but it's not Fidel anymore. My apologies. He has been iconic for a lot of people for a long time, and then you just keep talking about him. But of course, then you may want to say, well, maybe that is not 100% authoritarian. Well, okay, but anyways, first there's that danger, or you could say that in a very closed authoritarian patriarchal society, this existential certainty that people have in life is so great that they are actually happier and more fulfilled than again in New York. So that's the first possibility. And the second possibility, the second way that this empirical dimension can be falsified, then, is that it can also be thought that authoritarianism actually leads to better outcomes. So let's look again at that China issue that we just said. Well, no, there's been more famines in China because of the authoritarianism. There's less information running around. Well, no country comes even close. Like no effort of the UN, of the US and the UN combined, of no Europe, European Union, no country comes even close to the success that China has had in poverty reduction. Like it's not even comparable. No enterprise in the world has ever come close to the success of authoritarian, dictatorial China. And then you have to say, well, maybe authoritarianism is what works. And then the human rights disease is empirical, and it's empirically false. And that is something that you have to contend with. That's something that you have to worry about if you make human rights empirical. And the final point I want to say is that this theory can fail to give clear answers in situations where we're tempted to sacrifice innocence for the greater good. Of course, there's some safeguards in the work of Mill and the work of Sen that tell us that should rarely, if ever, be needed. But consequentialism, because of the logic of the doctrine, based on the consequences, can never really close that temptation. And then consider the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that ended the eastern, what would be called far eastern theater of the Second World War. You could say, well, it provided some good outcomes. Oh, it reduced the suffering of the soldiers. It reduced the suffering also of Japanese soldiers who would not be fighting in every city, in every town. It reduced the suffering of a significant part of the Japanese population, again, because there would not be fighting in every city, in every town. But then it also bombed, annihilated, burned the innocent, because it was a bombing target on civilians. It was technically a war crime. I mean, really a war crime. And then, is that correct? Was that the right thing to do? Was that a human rights violation? So if you take the consequentialist perspective, you have to be very very doubtful in your answer. Well, you have to say, well, we need to do some very large calculations here. We need to map the human suffering of the war effort as it progresses, without the bombs and with the bombs, and compare them and see if we get a substantial difference. And then we would know if it was a human rights violation, really, really, or if it just appears to be. But then something seems to be going severely wrong there, right? Because for example, if you go back to natural law theory, one of the things we would claim to know is that bombing the innocent, not as a side effect, not as something as collateral damage, but just directly targeting the innocent. There's the children and there's the women and there's the elderly. So not soldiers, not combatants in that town of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we're going to essentially burn them to a crisp. So the lucky and the unlucky will, suffer tremendously. That's our plan. That's our plan of action. Uh, we From a natural law perspective, we'll say we know immediately, right now, that this is a crime. So, whereas in the consequentialist theory, if we want to accuse Truman of criminality, we end up in this sort of economic discussion about cost and benefits, where you don't really are not really able to take a clear stance, and then you say, well, haven't we lost something in moving into this type of theory if it turns out that we do not know something so basic? But then again, consequentialists would say, well, maybe you have to calculate. Well, a case like this puts me in doubt, and I already told you this is a theory that I instinctively am attracted to, but problems like this do worry me. Okay, so that's good for today. This is a bit of an experimental way of doing this. Normally, I would use a PowerPoint, but I wanted to do something different because I guess I was tired of looking at PowerPoints. I hope this works. This will be accompanied with a text and which open to questions and comments as needed. Thank you very much for your attention.